Freezing, she snuck into the human's home. I can cook. Bear your children. Just don't throw me out.
The stairwell reeked of rust, wet stone, and something faintly sour from the drain in the corner. Jonas Rourke climbed the chipped steps, his hand brushing the cold metal rail. The lights above buzzed, flickering in uneven intervals, leaving moments of shadow between each landing. It had been another long day at the archives, hours bent over brittle pages in damp storage rooms, coaxing warped bindings back into shape, repairing history one fragile seam at a time. His eyes still ached from the low work lamps, his shoulders stiff from holding the same posture too long. He reached the third floor and paused. This building carried sound well. Footsteps echoing from below, the muted clatter of a pan from another unit, a cough through thin walls. Tonight, his own door was silent. He unlocked the deadbolt and pushed inside, already thinking of boiling water for tea and eating something cold just to avoid cooking. The narrow apartment was as he had left it, until his gaze caught movement by the stove. She was crouched low, arms clamped around herself, head slightly lowered, but eyes locked on him the instant he entered. Her skin was rose-violet, slick with melting snow, her long black hair streaked with silver blue and hanging wet against her cheeks. The clothing she wore was barely clothing at all. A thin, soaked silk wrap tied high over her chest, a dark skirt slit to her thigh, clinging to her form in the lamplight. Her bare feet were red from the cold. She didn't look like she had the strength to stand, yet her posture made it clear she was ready to flee if she had to. Jonas closed the door behind him, keeping his tone flat. "Get up." Her voice came thin but steady. "If you throw me out, do it after I warm my hands. I can cook. I can clean. I can bear your children. Just don't throw me out." The words hit him wrong. Too rehearsed, like something she'd said before, maybe to men who would only let her stay if she offered herself. He studied her face. She wasn't seducing him. She was negotiating survival. "How did you get in?" he asked. She nodded toward the frosted window. "Drain pipe. Ledge. Your latch was loose." Jonas stepped over, touched the bent latch. The steel was twisted enough to slip open with a shove. He looked back at her. "Why here? You keep your lamp low. Your curtains closed." Quiet men make fewer demands. He didn't like how easily she had read him, but he also saw the way her hands trembled, not from fear alone, but from cold that had sunk deep. Outside, Dravara 8's outer district offered no shelter worth a name. If she went back out there tonight, she might not come back. "Sit closer to the stove," he said. She shifted in small movements, as if every joint hurt. Steam began to lift from her hair. Her shoulders stayed tense, ready to react. Jonas went to the cupboard, took out a clean towel, and held it toward her. For a moment, she just stared at it, then reached. Her fingers brushed his, ice cold. "I don't want your children," he said, setting the kettle on the plate. A flicker passed through her amber eyes. "Good. You're hungry." "Yes." Jonas measured beans and cracked grain into a pot, added water, and lit the burner. She watched each movement like she was assessing whether he was dangerous or not. He noticed her feet again, red, raw-looking. He fetched an old blanket and tossed it to her. She wrapped it around her legs without a word. "What's your name?" he asked. "Later," she said. "That's not a name. It's the only one you get for now." Jonas didn't push. He took off his damp coat and draped it by the heater. The apartment smelled faintly of paper glue and leather from the books he'd repaired earlier. He tried to picture how she'd gotten here, crossing wet rooftops or slipping through alleys where no one cared if she collapsed. As he stirred the pot, he realized she was watching him, not with gratitude, but with calculation. She was working out whether she could trust him, same as he was deciding whether to let her stay. When the food was ready, he set a bowl in front of her. She ate with controlled, small bites, as if she didn't want her body to reject the meal. After a few mouthfuls, she said quietly, "Archive man, you fix pages. I restore what can be saved." Her gaze slid to the drying line of books near the heater. "You like things that last." Jonas didn't answer. She finished the food, set the bowl down, and leaned her head toward the stove. The tension in her shoulders eased a fraction. He thought about telling her to leave anyway. Letting someone in, especially someone whose full story he didn't know, meant taking on risk he had avoided for years. But the truth was simple. Throwing her out into that frozen night would be a death sentence. And for reasons he didn't care to analyze yet, he wasn't ready to watch her walk out into that. "You can have the bed," he said finally. "I'll take the chair." Her chin lifted, a trace of pride in the gesture. "I didn't ask for your bed. You didn't have to. You can't stand steady. The chair's worse." She hesitated, then nodded once. She crossed the room with slow, careful steps, the oversized shirt he'd given her hanging loose over her hips. She lay down, facing the wall. Within minutes, her breathing evened, but Jonas stayed awake in the chair, watching the frost crawl along the window. She hadn't told him her name. She hadn't told him why she'd chosen his apartment, and he knew by morning he'd want to know both answers. Jonas woke before the gray light of morning reached the frosted window. The air was cold enough to make each breath visible. He sat in the chair for a long moment, listening to the faint hum of the old heater and the slow, steady breathing from the bed. Lyrian hadn't moved much during the night. She lay curled beneath the blanket, one hand tucked under her cheek, the oversized shirt he'd given her sliding off one shoulder. For the first time since he'd found her crouched by the stove, she looked unguarded. His mind was already turning over questions he'd avoided the night before. Where'd she come from exactly? Why had she singled out his apartment? Was someone looking for her? And if so, how soon could they come knocking? He'd learned to weigh these kinds of risks years ago, back when Dravara 8's outer districts still pretended to be safe. Now it was just routine. Keep to yourself, keep your door locked, keep the world small enough to control. Letting her in last night had broken that rule. He stood and moved quietly to the small counter. The floor creaked, and she stirred, her eyes opening slowly. They focused on him almost instantly, alert despite the fatigue in them. "You didn't sleep much," she said. "I wasn't the one freezing all day," he replied. "How's your leg?" She sat up, pulling the blanket with her. "Still numb. Better than outside." She scanned the room, her gaze landing on the latch he had bent back into place last night. "You fixed it already?" "Not yet, but I will. Don't need strangers thinking this place is easy to get into." Her jaw tightened, and she looked toward the window. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Jonas leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "You haven't. Yet. But I need to know if someone's going to come looking for you." "No one will," she said without hesitation. It was the kind of answer meant to shut down questions, but Jonas wasn't satisfied. "That's not the same as saying no one cares where you are." "They don't," she said, eyes lowering to the blanket. "Not anymore." The tone wasn't defensive, just final. He decided not to push further, at least not now. He turned to the cupboard, measured out water and grounds into the dented coffee pot. The smell began to fill the small apartment, sharp and warm. She watched him work, then asked, "Why do you live alone?" "Cheaper," he said at first, then added, "and quieter. I like knowing that everything in this room is where I left it." "Until last night," she said. "Until last night." He set 2 chipped mugs on the table and poured coffee into both. She reached for one, wrapping her hand around it. Her fingers were still red from the cold, but they didn't shake as much. "I'll work for my stay," she said. "Cooking, cleaning, whatever you let me do." "I'm not hiring," Jonas said. "I'm not asking for pay," she countered. "I'm asking for time. Time to figure out what comes next." Her voice was calm, but he could hear the strain beneath it. She wasn't bargaining for comfort. She was bargaining for survival. "You cook?" he asked. "Yes. You'll need to work with what's here. No extra rations coming in for a while." "That's fine. I've made meals with less." He didn't doubt it. She took a sip of coffee, winced at the bitterness, then drank again. "You never told me what you do with the archives." "I fix what's falling apart," he said. "Old records, books, maps. Things the city hasn't decided to burn yet. Why bother? No one out here cares about old paper. That's why someone has to. Memory disappears fast enough without help." Her gaze lingered on him after that, like she was trying to decide if she believed he meant it. When the coffee was gone, she rose from the bed, still wrapped in the blanket, and crossed to the small sink. She began rinsing the mugs without being asked, her movements deliberate, as though she was proving she meant what she'd said about working for her stay. Jonas noticed she glanced toward the door twice while she worked. Not in a panicked way, more like someone used to checking escape routes. It told him more about her than anything she'd said out loud. "Lyrian," he said, testing the name she had given him. "If you stay, it's not for one night. If I let you in once, it's not to watch you freeze tomorrow." She set the mugs down, water dripping from her fingers, and turned toward him. "Then you'd better be sure you can live with me here." He thought about it longer than he expected. "I'll fix the window today. After that, we'll see." A small, quick nod was her only answer. She went back to the stove, adding a piece of kindling from a small pile. The fire caught, casting light across the damp edges of her hair. The room felt warmer than it had in months, though Jonas wasn't ready to decide if it was just the stove. He didn't know what her full story was yet, but the fact that she was still here this morning, still watching him, still testing his reactions, told him one thing clearly. She hadn't chosen his apartment by accident, and that meant she had a reason for staying that went beyond the cold. He just didn't know what it was yet. The window latch was still bent, and Jonas had been staring at it for nearly a full minute, debating whether to fix it with the tools he had or make the trip to the hardware stall on Kether Row. Lyrian stood behind him, the blanket now draped over her shoulders like a shawl. She hadn't said much since breakfast, just moved around the room quietly, collecting the cups, wiping down the small table, and folding the sheet from the bed. She didn't act like a guest, and she didn't act like someone afraid to touch what wasn't hers. She acted like she intended to be here tomorrow and the day after that. "You didn't come through the drain pipe for nothing," Jonas said, not turning from the window. "You had somewhere else to try first." She hesitated, and he could hear her shifting her weight. "I had 10 places. Yours was the only one with a light still on and no noise inside. And if I hadn't opened the door, I wouldn't have knocked. I only knock if I'm ready to run," she said, "and I was done running last night." He turned then, meeting her eyes. "Done because you were tired, or because you had nowhere else?" "Both." She adjusted the blanket tighter. "You asked yesterday if anyone would come looking for me. No one will. But if I stayed out there longer, I'd have ended up in the shelter queue. And that's worse than the street. You go in alone, you don't come out the same." It was the most she'd offered about herself so far, and Jonas caught the flicker of something in her voice. Not fear exactly, but memory. He didn't push. He learned the hard way that when someone volunteered a piece of their history, the worst thing you could do was demand a rest. He picked up his small toolkit from the shelf and knelt by the window. The latch would need more than just bending back. The screws were stripped. He glanced over his shoulder. "If you're planning to use the window again, say so now. Saves me the trouble of fixing it." A faint smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. "If I leave, I'll use the door. Easier on the hands." It was a small joke, but it landed. Jonas turned back to the latch and started working it free. The sound of the screwdriver clicking against the metal filled the room, along with the low crackle from the stove. After a few minutes, Lyrian asked, "Why do you care about fixing old paper? It doesn't keep you warm. You can't eat it." He kept working, answering without looking up. "Because once it's gone, no one remembers it existed. Then the people who come after us have to guess. And guesses turn into lies faster than truth does." She studied him for a moment before asking, "And how many people care about those lies out here?" "Not many," he admitted, "but some." When he finished the latch, he tested it twice before standing. The window now sealed tight, shutting out the faint whistle of the wind. Better. She stepped closer to the glass, almost touching it, eyes scanning the view beyond. The crumbling rooftops, the mist curling between alleyways, the distant, sluggish glow of the district's main thoroughfare. "It's quiet here," she said. "That's the point," Jonas replied. Her gaze stayed on the street below. "It's too quiet to stay invisible for long. Someone will notice." That caught him. "Notice what?" "That I'm here. People talk. Neighbors guess. And sometimes they guess out loud to the wrong person." She finally turned back toward him. "It's why I don't stay anywhere long. Until last night." Jonas studied her. She wasn't warning him. She was giving him a chance to tell her to leave. Instead, he said, "Then we don't give them anything to notice." Her eyes searched his face for a moment before she gave a slow nod. "I can live with that." The rest of the day settled into a rhythm. She cleaned without being told, stacking books he'd left near the heater, straightening his small shelf of tools, and setting the fire so the room stayed warm without burning through too much wood. She cooked a thin stew from the odds and ends in his cupboard, tasting and adjusting until it was better than he expected from the ingredients. He realized, sometime in the quiet between tasks, that he hadn't thought about sending her away since breakfast. Whatever her past was, whatever had brought her up that drain pipe, she had already made herself part of this space. And for the first time in a long while, Jonas didn't mind. What he didn't know yet, what neither of them had said out loud, was how long that would last. But tonight, at least, she wasn't going back into the cold. By the next morning, the apartment smelled faintly of last night's stew and drywood smoke. Jonas woke to the sound of something light scraping across the table. When he lifted his head, Lyrian was standing there, sorting a small pile of loose pages he'd left out, a habit he rarely tolerated from anyone. Her fingertips were careful, tracing the edges without bending them. She glanced up when she noticed he was watching. They were stacked wrong, she said simply, setting the last page down in perfect alignment. Jonas swung his legs off the bed, rubbing his eyes. You could have asked. You could have locked them away, she countered. You didn't. That told me you trust them to be seen. Her logic was blunt, not defensive. He watched her for another beat before standing. They're from a municipal ledger. Records of who lived here before this district was gutted. Her brow furrowed. You keep those. Someone should, he said, moving to the stove. Not everything worth remembering fits in the city's version of history. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and leaned against the table. The city's version doesn't include people like me. That was the most personal thing she'd said so far, and he caught the slight tightening of her jaw as if she already regretted saying it. Jonas didn't press. He poured water into the kettle, set it over the burner, and let the silence work for them both. When the kettle hissed, he poured 2 mugs, sliding one across to her. She wrapped her hands around it, inhaling the steam before taking a cautious sip. Do you work every day? 6 days, he said. Rest day's mine. Today's one of them. And you spend it here? It's warm here, he said, glancing toward the window. Outside, the frost clung to the glass like a second skin. Out there, not much worth the trip unless you need something. She studied him for a moment, then said, I'll cook something better tonight, but I'll need to get a few things. I can trade for them if I have to. Trade what? Her eyes shifted away. I still have 1 piece of copper and a strip of cloth good enough for binding. Someone will want it. Jonas didn't like the way she said, if I have to, but he also knew better than to take away the decisions that had kept her alive. We'll go together, he said. Her gaze flicked back to him quickly, measuring his tone. You don't have to follow me. I'm not following you. I'm making sure my copper doesn't disappear into a pocket we don't see again. That earned the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth. Fair enough. They left the apartment an hour later, both wrapped in worn coats, keeping their heads down as they walked the uneven street. Dravara 8's outer district was quieter in the morning, the market stalls still being set up, vendors shuffling through crates with stiff fingers. Most passersby didn't look twice, but Jonas caught the way one man leaned on a rail and watched Lyrian for a second too long. She noticed too. Her hand tightened briefly on the edge of her coat before she let it fall. They bought dried root vegetables, a handful of spice packets, and a small sack of flour. She did the talking, short and efficient, her voice carrying enough confidence to avoid the outsider prices vendors often tried on strangers. By the time they returned, her cheeks had a faint color from the cold, and the corners of her coat bulged slightly more than they had when they'd left. Jonas didn't ask. She didn't explain, but when she unpacked the food, there were a few extras, a small tin of salt, a bundle of dried greens, that he hadn't seen her trade for. She caught him looking and said, "Not everything costs money if you know who owes who." That night, the stew tasted richer, the bread less dense. She ate without hurry, meeting his eyes only when she was sure he was watching her. The apartment felt smaller again, not from the space they took up, but from the quiet awareness between them, a constant measure of how close they were willing to get and how far they were willing to let the other in. For Jonas, the decision to let her stay another night wasn't even a decision anymore. It had already been made somewhere between the market stalls and the moment she'd set the extra tin of salt on his counter without asking if he wanted it. The heater rattled once and went silent. Jonas set his tools down on the counter, listening for it to kick back on. It didn't. The night air was already pressing through the cracks in the walls, colder than it had been in weeks. Lyrian looked up from where she was kneading dough on the small table, her hands dusted white with flour. "That's not coming back, is it?" she asked. "Not until the landlord decides it's worth fixing, which means not this month." She glanced toward the stove. "We'll need more wood." Jonas nodded. "I'll get it." By the time he returned from the storage room downstairs, she had already pushed the table closer to the stove and laid 2 blankets on the floor. The bread dough was covered and resting in a bowl by the heat. "It's warmer here," she said. "The bed's too far from the fire." He didn't argue. They ate the bread later with leftover stew, sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of the stove, the flames snapping quietly. The air between them felt different, less cautious, more settled. When the last of the bread was gone, she pulled one of the blankets over her lap and stretched her legs out toward the fire. "You didn't tell me," she said. "Tell you what? That you lived here before the district started falling apart." He gave her a look. "How do you know I did? You don't move like someone who came in after. You don't scan every doorway. You know where the cracks in the street are before you step." She shrugged. "It's the way locals walk." He considered that for a moment, then said, "Born 3 blocks over. Family's gone now." She didn't ask how. They both knew the answer in a place like this. Instead, she leaned back on her hands, the firelight catching on her skin, bringing out the faint opalescent sheen he hadn't noticed before. "You're not asking me where I came from," she said after a pause. "You'll tell me if you want to." That earned him a longer look than usual. "Maybe I will." The heater's absence made the room grow colder faster than the stove could keep up. When Jonas added the last stick of wood, Lyrian shifted, pulling the blanket higher over her legs. "You should move closer," she said. He did, sitting beside her. The warmth was immediate, but so was the awareness of her shoulder against his. She didn't pull away. For a while, they just watched the fire, listening to the occasional pop of the wood and the faint hum of wind against the window. Her voice came low, almost careful. "Where I was before, no one sat this close unless they wanted something." Jonas kept his eyes on the fire. "And you think I want something? I think you're not sure yet." He turned his head, meeting her gaze. There was no challenge in it, just observation. "Maybe I am," he said. Her lips curved slightly, not a smile but close. She shifted again, the blanket sliding enough to expose her bare knee. The heat between them wasn't just from the stove now. He could feel it in the air, in the way she stayed where she was instead of creating distance. The wood burned down to embers. She leaned into him then, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't speak. Outside, the wind kept pressing at the building, but in that moment, the cold stayed on the other side of the walls. For the first time since she had climbed through his window, he felt her weight against him without tension in it. Not survival, not calculation, just a choice to stay there. By morning, the fire had burned low, and the air in the apartment had a sharp edge again. Jonas woke first, his neck stiff from sleeping half-sitting against the wall. Lyrian was still wrapped in the blanket beside him, her head against his shoulder, breathing evenly. He waited before moving, not wanting to break whatever had kept her there through the night. When she finally stirred, she didn't sit up right away. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim light. "You stayed here the whole night," she said quietly. "You didn't give me a reason to move," he replied. For a moment, she said nothing, then pushed the blanket off her shoulders. The shirt she wore had slipped down one side, exposing more of her rose-violet skin. She didn't adjust it. Instead, she pulled her knees close, arms draped loosely over them, and looked at the floor like she was considering something. "You asked me before if someone might come looking for me," she said. "The truth is they won't, but not because they don't know where I am." Jonas kept his eyes on her, letting her take the time she needed. "I left the place I was working," she continued. "It wasn't work anyone chose. You do what they tell you. You sleep where they put you. They don't chain you, but they don't have to, because you don't survive long outside. I lasted longer than most, and when I walked away, I didn't run. I just kept moving until I found someplace no one recognized my face. Jonas didn't speak. She was watching him now, gauging whether he believed her. They'll let me disappear because it's easier than bringing me back. But disappearing means you don't stay anywhere long enough to matter. She glanced toward the small table with the ledger pages. Until now. He crossed to the counter, poured water into the pot, and set it to boil. And you're telling me this because I want you to know I didn't choose your place because it was the first warm one I found. I chose it because I saw the way you treated what's in here. Her eyes flicked toward the books and papers, then back to him. If you take care of that, you might take care of someone like me without turning it into a debt I can't pay. The kettle hissed softly. Jonas poured coffee into 2 mugs and set one in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it, holding it as if the warmth mattered more than the drink. I don't make promises I can't keep, he said. I'm not asking for promises, she answered. I'm asking for a chance to stay still for longer than a night or 2. They drank in silence after that, the weight of her words settling into the room. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, but the latch he'd fixed held firm. When they finished, she moved to the sink and washed the mugs. Jonas noticed she kept glancing toward him as she worked, not suspicious, not wary, but as if she was still trying to figure out where his limits were. That evening, she cooked again, this time seasoning the stew with the small tin of salt she'd somehow gotten from the market. They ate at the table, both aware that something between them had shifted. She had told him enough to trust him with her past, and he had given her no reason to regret it. Later, when the fire was the only light in the room, she sat beside him again. She didn't lean against him this time, but she stayed close enough that her knee brushed his, and she didn't move away. Jonas understood the choice she had made. She was letting herself believe that here, at least for now, she wasn't going to be forced back into the cold. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the loose siding of the building. Jonas sat at the table, repairing the cracked spine of a ledger under the glow of the wall lamp. The room was warm from the steady fire, but the noise outside kept the air tight with an odd kind of tension. Lyrian was at the stove, ladling the last of the stew into 2 bowls. She had removed the oversized coat hours ago, wearing only the shirt he'd given her and a skirt she'd mended herself the day before. Her movements were slower tonight, deliberate in a way that drew his attention without her having to speak. She set 1 bowl in front of him, her fingers brushing his for just a second longer than needed. You work late for a man with no deadlines, she said. He closed the ledger carefully. Deadlines keep things from being done right. Or keep people from getting too close, she said. Jonas didn't answer immediately. He had learned long ago that with certain people, the more you tried to explain yourself, the more ground you gave away. But Lyrian wasn't prying for advantage. He could tell from her eyes she was testing the ground between them, seeing if it could hold more weight. They ate quietly, the sound of the wind and the occasional crackle from the fire filling the gaps. When the bowls were empty, she collected them without being asked and set them in the sink. Then she didn't move away. Instead, she leaned back against the counter, watching him in a way that made the air between them feel narrower. Before I came here, she said, nobody sat with me without wanting something. Even the ones who were kind still wanted their price paid in some way. She pushed the hair from her face, her gaze steady. You haven't asked for anything. That makes it harder to know what you're waiting for. Jonas rested his forearms on the table. Maybe I'm not waiting for anything. Everyone waits for something, she said softly. The question is whether you tell the other person what it is. He stood then, not quickly, but with the weight of a decision he hadn't been ready to make until now. He crossed the short distance between them. She didn't step back. The firelight caught in her amber eyes, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. When he reached out, his hand touched her arm first, lightly, as if giving her the choice to step away. She didn't. Her skin was warm, the faint opalescent sheen shifting with the movement of her breathing. He felt her pulse quicken under his fingertips. Lyrian's voice was barely above a whisper. If I stay here, it can't be like the other places I've stayed. It won't be, Jonas said, and the certainty in his tone surprised even him. She searched his face for a moment longer, then closed the last bit of space between them. Her hand slid lightly over his forearms, up to his shoulders, resting there as if she was measuring the reality of him. When he leaned in, it wasn't rushed. His forehead touched hers first, the warmth of her breath mixing with his. Then her lips met his, soft, deliberate, unhurried. The kiss wasn't about claiming, it was about allowing. Each second felt like a test they were both passing. Her hands moved to the sides of his neck, his slid to her waist, pulling her closer only when she leaned into him on her own. When they parted, she didn't move far, staying close enough that her words reached him like they were meant only for him. If you change your mind, you tell me before I find out another way. I won't change my mind, he said, and this time he knew it was true. They stayed by the stove for the rest of the night, talking in quiet voices about nothing urgent. Her skill with cooking that came from years of making too little food stretch too far, his work in the archives, and the things he'd seen tucked into old books that no one else cared about. The wind outside kept trying to press in, but inside, the space felt sealed. When they finally moved to the bed, it wasn't out of necessity to keep warm. It was choice. And for both of them, that choice meant more than anything they said out loud. The wind outside had eased to a dull hum, but the cold still pressed at the window. Jonas shut the latch and turned back toward the bed, where Lyrian sat with the blanket pulled around her waist. The shirt she wore had slipped from one shoulder, and her long hair fell loose down her back, dark and still faintly damp from the steam of the stove kettle earlier. She watched him with that same measured gaze she'd given him since the night she'd come through his window, part caution, part curiosity, and now something warmer underneath. He crossed the small space between them, the boards underfoot groaning softly. Lyrian didn't move back when he sat beside her. The heat from her body reached him before he touched her, and when his hand found her knee, she didn't flinch. Her skin was warm against his cold fingers. She laid her own hand over his, the contact steady and deliberate. "You've let me stay longer than I thought you would," she said quietly. "You've made it hard to imagine this place without you," he answered. Her lips curved slightly, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was something more grateful, though she didn't name it. She shifted, turning toward him fully, and rested one hand against his chest. He could feel the faint thud of her fingers tapping once before settling there, as though reassuring herself he was real. Jonas lifted his other hand to her cheek. Her skin held the residual warmth of the fire, smooth beneath his palm. She leaned into the touch, closing her eyes for a moment before meeting his again. The distance between them closed slowly, as if neither wanted to rush this. When their lips met, it was unhurried, a slow press that deepened only when she leaned closer. Her breath mixed with his, carrying a faint trace of the stew they'd shared for dinner. His hand slid from her cheek to the back of her neck, holding her there as though letting go might undo the fragile certainty between them. She brought her other hand to his side, curling into him until their knees touched, then their legs. They shifted together onto the bed without breaking contact, the blanket gathering around them. Jonas lay back enough for her to follow, their bodies aligning naturally. He traced his hand along her arm, feeling the subtle strength in her frame. Her fingers found the edge of his shirt, brushing lightly against the skin beneath, but her touch stayed slow, deliberate, asking without words if he was ready for her to continue. He answered by pulling her closer, one arm around her back, the other resting at her hip. Her breathing deepened, matching his. She tilted her head to kiss him again, this time with more certainty, her lips parting just enough to draw him in. The room seemed to shrink to the sound of their breathing, the faint rustle of fabric, and the occasional pop from a stove. When they finally paused, her forehead rested against his. "I told you once I couldn't stay anywhere long," she whispered. "And I told you we'd see," he said. Her hand tightened slightly against his side. "I don't want to leave." "You won't," he said without hesitation. They stayed tangled together under the blanket, the fire casting shifting shadows across the wall. Jonas felt the cold outside fading from his thoughts entirely. Her head rested against his chest, and he listened to the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing, each rise and fall syncing with his own. Before sleep took them, She murmured something so low he almost didn't catch it. "This feels like the first place I belonged." Jonas tightened his arm around her. "Then it's yours as much as mine." The wind outside moved on. The fire burned steady. And for the first time in years, Jonas felt the room not as a space he kept alone, but as a place that was finally full. Days turned into weeks, and the routines they had built settled into something that felt unshakable. The cold still ruled Dravara 8's outer district, but inside Jonas's apartment, warmth lived in more than just the fire. Lyrian moved through the small space with a quiet confidence now, no longer glancing toward the door as if preparing to run. The blanket she used to keep around her shoulders hung folded neatly on the back of a chair, kept for the coldest hours, not for defense. Jonas had changed too. He found himself looking forward to the sound of her steps in the morning, the soft clink of mugs when she made coffee before he rose. He still worked on his ledgers and repairs, but he worked faster now, knowing there was someone waiting to share a meal with him when he was done. That morning, a pale winter light filtered through the window. She was at the table, shaping dough for bread, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. The fire crackled steadily, the air smelling faintly of flour and spice. Jonas set a small bundle of kindling by the stove and leaned against the counter, just watching her work. "You're staring," she said without looking up. "Maybe I am." "Why?" "Because you look like you've been here forever." She smiled faintly at that, her hands never stopping their work. "Feels like I have." The bread went into the small oven, and they sat together, talking about nothing urgent. What she'd make for dinner tomorrow, whether they should trade for more salt when the weather might finally turn. It was the kind of conversation neither of them would have imagined sharing when she first climbed through his window. When the bread was ready, they ate it still warm, butter melting into the soft crust. She laughed, genuine and unguarded, at something he said about the market vendor's crooked scale, and he realized he'd never heard that sound from her before. After the meal, she cleared the table while he stacked more wood beside the stove. But when she turned back toward him, her expression had changed. She hesitated, then came to stand in front of him, her hands folded together. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. Jonas straightened, reading the seriousness in her voice. "All right." She took a slow breath, her eyes fixed on his. "I'm pregnant." The words landed heavily in the quiet room. For a moment, he didn't move, not because he was unsure, but because he understood the weight behind her saying it. She hadn't come here expecting to build a life, certainly not to start one. He stepped closer, resting his hands gently on her arms. "How long have you known?" "A few days. I waited because I wasn't sure how you'd take it." Jonas's grip on her arms tightened just enough to keep her steady. "You thought I'd tell you to leave?" Her eyes softened, though there was still a trace of uncertainty. "It's happened before. Not with you, just before." "You're not leaving," he said firmly. She exhaled slowly, as if she'd been holding her breath for days. "I didn't think I wanted this. Not here. Not now. But when I found out, I didn't feel afraid the way I thought I would." Jonas brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Because you're not alone this time." For the first time since she'd arrived, she let him see her without the layer of self-protection she carried everywhere. She leaned into him, pressing her forehead against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her as though nothing outside those walls could touch them. They stayed like that for a long time, the only sounds the quiet burn of the fire and the steady rhythm of their breathing. When she finally stepped back, there was a new steadiness in her eyes. "This place, it's not just yours anymore," she said. Jonas glanced toward the window, where the frost still clung to the glass, and then back to her. "It never was, since the night you came in." That night, they sat close by the fire, talking about what would change, what wouldn't, and how they would make room for the life that was coming. Outside, the district was still cold, still indifferent. But inside, the warmth between them was real, and now it had a future. And for both of them, that was the ending they hadn't known they were looking for.